context is important, and we in Tomorrow Today try and understand context. I'm going to tell you 4 stories that help us understand a little bit better the dilemma of the South China Sea. The South China Sea has been described as an accident waiting to happen. It's a dispute around territorial waters and what is known as the expanded economic zone. Here are the 4 stories. In 1381, a young Muslim boy is captured by the Ming dynasty, taken in as a slave into the Ming household. He's made a eunuch, he's renamed Zheng He, and much like the story of Joseph in the Bible, he rises to a position of great prominence in the Chinese Navy. The Navy is built of 3,500 vessels, the largest of which is 10 times the size of Columbus's vessel 100 years later. So it was a sizable navy. They go on voyages of discovery far beyond the South China Sea. In fact, they reach the east coast of Africa in modern-day Kenya. On one of the voyages, in 1433, Zheng He dies on board on the way home. And for a change of politics, reasons beyond our understanding, the Chinese Navy is decommissioned. In fact, all the boats are burnt. And so the historical claim that China has to their rights in the South China Sea is based on the exploits of Zheng He that date back to the 14th century. For the second story, let's wind forward 200 years. We now go to the early part of the 16th century. And in 1605, a Dutch vessel ransacks a Portuguese vessel in the South China Sea, taking all their goods. They bring it back to Holland and they decide that they'd better have a good rationale for having done that. They turn to a brilliant young lawyer by the name of Hugo Grotius, who's 21 at the time. Grotius was a child prodigy. He was at university at the age of 11. And they say to him, can you give us a rationale for why it was okay to take the goods? And he comes up with a charter known as the Freedom of the Seas, which is the underpinning of today's maritime law. Basically, the claim that the Portuguese had to having been there first, Grotius completely destroys by telling them the story of Zheng He, who was there before them a good 200 years earlier. And so you now have a historical claim by China versus an international legal claim by other countries who border the South China Sea. And you can see the immediate paradox of that, historical versus a legal claim. 2 of the stories shed an ideological footprint on the South China Sea. And the third story that does this is a story of nationalism. The story of nationalism is that there was an admiral in the US Navy by the name of Mahon. And he was very well respected. He wrote on naval strategy. Most of his work was translated into multiple languages worldwide, picked up by the Japanese, the German, the British, and many other nations. A young minister or secretary, rather, to the Navy by the name of Theodore Roosevelt goes to the Navy College, encounters this admiral, and almost comes under his spell. Well, as you know, Teddy Roosevelt later became president of the United States. And when he did so, he took the ideology of Mahon with him into the White House. And basically that ideology was, if you want to be a superpower, you have to have a sizable navy. It was a strong claim to nationalism. And so today in the South China Sea, you have countries, China, which has rebuilt their navy, the United States, which has always had a sizable navy, a claim of nationalism based on sizable, powerful navies. The fourth story involves an editor, a reporter. And this particular reporter was a pacifist. In fact, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1934. He did a tour of the United States in 1914, in which he proclaimed there'd never be another war amongst the superpowers in Europe. This was in January 1914. And Norman Aspel, which is his name, he sounded like he knew what he was talking about. Of course, a few months later, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. And 5 weeks after that assassination, in June of 1914, World War I breaks out. And Aspel looks like an idiot. He looks like he's got it completely wrong. What he, however, said is that not so much there would never be another war, but he said that war was never a good way to settle a dispute. So here you have a kind of rationale or an ideology that says the interdependency of nations will make war a really silly way to resolve a dispute. So in the South China Sea, when you look at the complexity and accident waiting to happen, you have a historical claim playing out against an international legal claim. You have an ideology of nationalism at work, as well as an ideology of interdependence, which hopefully will keep conflict at bay. It's complex, isn't it? But if we're to do our work and understand global issues more thoroughly, we really do need to dig a bit deeper than the one-sided stories that we are often fed, depending on what geography we live in or what news we're following. Leaders need to understand context, and context can often be best understood by uncovering stories that inhabit that particular context.